The clock on the nightstand read 3:07 a.m. when I heard it. Not a knock exactly, more like a fingernail dragging slowly across the front door, once, twice, then a pause, then again. I hadn't been sleeping anyway. I never sleep well anymore, not since my son died. You get used to the dark, I suppose. You get used to lying there listening to a house that's too quiet, counting the sounds that aren't there. His footsteps in the hallway, the creak of the refrigerator door at midnight, the way he used to hum to himself without realizing it. Small things, the kind you don't know you're memorizing until they're gone. It had been 4 years since the accident. 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days, if I'm being precise. And I am always precise about it, even when I don't want to be. I sat up in bed and I listened. Then I heard it. Quiet, almost nothing, but unmistakably a voice. Dad. My chest stopped. Dad, it's cold out here. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because I've asked myself 1,000 times since whether I was rational, whether I was thinking clearly, whether grief had finally unraveled something in me that couldn't be put back together. The truth is, I didn't think at all. I just moved. My feet found the floor. My hand found the wall. And I walked to the front door of my house in Kingsford, Ohio at 3 in the morning because my dead son was standing on the other side of it. Except, of course, he wasn't. My name is Arthur Klein. I'm 63 years old. I worked 31 years as a civil engineer for the county before I retired, and I have lived in the same 2-story house on Mercer Lane since 1994. I raised 2 children in this house, my son Elliot and my daughter June. Their mother Donna passed from ovarian cancer in 2017. 3 years after that, Elliot was killed when a drunk driver ran a red light on Route 9 just outside of Millbrook. He was 31 years old. He had been on his way home from his shift at the distribution center where he'd worked since finishing his associate's degree. After Elliot died, it was just June and me, and eventually, just me, when June married and moved to Raleigh. I don't say that with resentment. She calls every Sunday. She offered to have me move in with them, and I told her I wasn't ready to leave the house yet. That was 3 years ago, and I'm still not ready. So maybe I never will be. I tell you all of this so you understand what kind of man I am. Practical, methodical, not given to imagination. I've never believed in ghosts. I've never had what you'd call a spiritual experience. I am the kind of man who, when his wife was dying, drove her to every appointment with a printed spreadsheet of her medications and treatment schedule, because that was the only way I knew how to help. So when I tell you what happened that night, I need you to understand that I am not a man who invents things. I opened the door. There was a young woman standing on my porch. She was maybe 25, 26, soaking wet from the rain that had started sometime after midnight. She was thin, too thin, I thought immediately, and she was wearing a gray hoodie that wasn't warm enough for an Ohio night in late October. She was shivering. She looked at me and her face did something complicated. Relief, I think, but also fear. And something else I couldn't name right away. She said, I wasn't sure you'd open it. I said, who are you? She hesitated. Then she said, I think I might be your son's daughter. I didn't let her in right away. I know that sounds cold, but you have to understand what I was standing there, processing at 3 in the morning. A stranger, a young woman, a claim that was, on its face, impossible because Elliot had never mentioned a child, never mentioned a pregnancy. Elliot had been engaged briefly in his mid-20s to a woman named Cassidy, but they'd broken it off before I ever met her family. After that, he dated occasionally, but nothing serious, nothing he ever brought home. I stood in the doorway for a long moment just looking at her. And then something happened that I am still not entirely able to explain. She pushed the wet hair back from her face, and when she did, The porch light caught her profile, the line of her jaw, the way she held her chin slightly forward, just slightly, when she was uncertain. Elliot used to do that. Every time he was about to say something he wasn't sure how to say, his chin would come forward just a little. Donna used to tease him about it. She called it his thinking jaw. I stepped back from the door and I said, "Come inside." Her name was Iris. Iris Mallory. Her mother, a woman named Colleen, had passed away 8 months earlier from a brain aneurysm. Colleen had never married. She'd raised Iris alone in a small apartment in Dayton, about 40 minutes south of Kingsford. Iris had grown up knowing almost nothing about her father. Colleen told her only that he was a kind man who didn't know she existed and that she'd made a choice not to tell him. That was all. No name, no city, nothing. After Colleen died, Iris found a box. She told me this sitting at my kitchen table, wrapped in one of Donna's old cardigans that I'd found in the hall closet. She held her mug of tea with both hands, and she spoke carefully, like someone who had rehearsed this many times and was still afraid of getting it wrong. The box was in the back of her mother's bedroom closet, behind winter coats. It had a small padlock on it, but Colleen had left the key on her keychain, the one Iris had taken from the hospital when they gave her mother's belongings. Inside the box was a stack of photographs, some letters, a copy of Iris's birth certificate with the father's name listed simply as EC, and a photograph of a man she didn't recognize. She showed it to me on her phone. She'd taken a picture of the picture. I looked at the photograph for a long time. It was Elliot. Maybe 24, 25. He was standing in front of what looked like a state park somewhere, squinting into the sun, smiling that sideways smile he had, the one where only the left side of his mouth came up because he was self-conscious about his teeth. I had to set the phone down on the table. I said, "Where did you get this?" She said, "It was in my mother's things." There were letters, too. He wrote to her, I think, for a little while, but she never answered them. "Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from tonight? What time is it there?" I asked because this story felt, to me, like something that only happens in the middle of the night, in the dark, when the rest of the world has gone quiet. If you're somewhere bright and busy, I'm glad. I hope you'll stay a while anyway. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. Iris slept on the couch. I insisted because she'd driven up from Dayton in the rain and she looked exhausted and underfed, and I was not capable of sending her back out into that weather, whatever the truth turned out to be. I sat in the kitchen until dawn with a cup of coffee that went cold, reading the letters she'd brought with her. There were 7 of them, written in Elliot's handwriting. I would have known it anywhere. That slightly cramped print he'd had since middle school, because he'd broken 2 fingers in a bike accident and they'd never set quite right. The letters were postmarked between 2015 and 2016, sent to an address in Dayton that wasn't the apartment Iris had grown up in. Colleen had apparently moved sometime after receiving them. None of the letters were angry. That was the first thing I noticed. I'd been bracing myself for something, accusations, demands, but they weren't that. They were just Elliot, asking how she was, saying he'd found work he liked, mentioning once that he thought about her and hoped she was okay, wondering in the last letter if he'd said or done something to upset her, and if so, that he was sorry. He hadn't meant to. He never knew. That was what broke me. Sitting there at my kitchen table at 5 in the morning, Elliot had spent years sending letters into silence, worrying that he'd done something wrong, and he had never known. He never got to know. Now I need to tell you about a man named Douglas Farr. I didn't know who Douglas Farr was until Iris told me, and when she did, I understood why she'd driven 40 minutes in the rain to knock on my door at 3 in the morning instead of simply calling or writing. Douglas Farr was Colleen's older brother. After Colleen died, he had shown up at Iris's apartment within 2 weeks. She described him as someone she'd seen maybe 3 times in her entire life. a vague, uncle-shaped figure from occasional holidays. And he had been helpful at first. He helped with the funeral arrangements. He brought food. He mentioned, gently, that Colleen had had some savings and that he thought they should discuss how to handle the estate. Colleen had approximately $47,000 in a savings account and a small life insurance policy worth $85,000. Not a fortune, but real money, meaningful money to a 25-year-old who'd been working 2 jobs since she was 18. Douglas told Iris that Colleen hadn't left a will, which was true, she hadn't, and that as next of kin, he and Iris would need to go through probate together. He offered to help coordinate everything. He knew a lawyer, he said, an old family friend who could help streamline the process and keep costs down. Iris, who had just lost her mother, who was grieving and overwhelmed and had never navigated anything like an estate, said yes. What she didn't know was that the lawyer Douglas brought in, a man named Warren Tuggle, operating out of a small office in Kettering, had his license suspended in 2019 for mishandling client funds. He'd gotten it reinstated on a provisional basis but had a disciplinary record with the Ohio bar that would have been easy to find if you knew to look. Over the following months, through a series of delays, misfiled documents and fees that kept appearing for services Iris couldn't quite track, nearly $40,000 of Colleen's savings had been routed through administrative accounts that Douglas controlled. Iris didn't realize what was happening at first. She's not stupid. She's actually quite sharp, but she was 25 and heartbroken and had no reason to believe that her uncle was methodically stealing from her dead mother's estate while pretending to help. She started to figure it out around month 6 when she asked Douglas a simple question about a disbursement and he couldn't give her a straight answer. When she pushed, he got cold. When she said she wanted to speak to the lawyer directly, Douglas told her she was being paranoid, that she didn't understand how these processes worked, that she should trust him because he was family, and he had her best interests at heart. She told me that word, paranoid, was what made her start keeping records. By the time she came to find me, she had a folder on her phone with screenshots of every document she'd received, every transaction she could trace, and 3 consultations with a legal aid attorney in Dayton who had confirmed that something was, in fact, very wrong. The legal aid attorney had told her that her best path forward was to establish her identity clearly as Colleen's only heir, which meant documenting her family history as completely as possible, which meant finding her father's family. She had done a search on the name from the birth certificate, cross-referenced with the postmarks on the letters, and a small detail. Colleen had mentioned once that Iris's father had worked in county infrastructure somewhere north of Dayton. She found Elliot's name in a local paper's archives, a brief article about a fundraiser he'd helped organize for the county parks department in 2014. And then she'd found his obituary. She told me she sat in her car in a parking lot for almost an hour after she found it. She'd spent months working up to the idea of showing up at a stranger's door to say, "I think your son was my father," and now the stranger's son was dead. She almost turned around. What made her keep going, she said, was the obituary listing a father. Me. She thought. Maybe there's still someone. Maybe there's still family. I want to be honest about what I felt in those first few days after Iris showed up on my porch. I felt stunned, obviously, but underneath the shock there was something else, something I'm almost embarrassed to admit. I felt grateful, which is not something I expected. Elliot was gone. But here was this young woman with his jaw and his slightly too serious way of looking at things, sitting in my kitchen eating scrambled eggs, and every time she did that thing with her chin when she was uncertain, I had to look away. Grief is strange. You think you've mapped the whole territory of it, and then something shifts the ground under your feet, and you find a part you hadn't been to before. I called June that morning. I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Dad, did you do a DNA test?" I had not done a DNA test. "Do one," she said. "Not because I don't believe her, but because you need to know, and so does she, before you both get any more tangled up in this." June was always the sensible one. We ordered 2 kits from a service online. It took 11 days to get the results. During those 11 days, Iris stayed in Kingsford. I offered her Elliot's old room, and she accepted after a moment of hesitation that told me she understood what I was offering. She found a temporary remote position doing data entry that let her work from my kitchen table. I made dinners. She washed dishes. We watched the news after dinner and argued mildly about whether the weather station was ever accurate. It was the most normal 11 days I'd had in years. When the results came, they came as an email with a link to a report. I read it twice before I let myself believe it. 99.998% probability of a grandparent-grandchild biological relationship. I printed it out. I don't know why. I just needed it to be a piece of paper I could hold. I called June and she cried, and then I cried, and we stayed on the phone for a long time not saying much of anything. Now came the part that required me to be the kind of man I used to be at work. Methodical. Precise. Patient with paperwork. I drove Iris to a meeting with a probate attorney in Columbus, a real one recommended by the Ohio State Bar's referral service, not by Douglas Farr. Her name was Patricia Elwood, and she had 22 years of experience in estate litigation and a demeanor that reminded me of Donna's oncologist. Direct, thorough, kind, in a way that didn't waste your time. Patricia reviewed everything Iris had compiled. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said that what she was looking at appeared to be a clear case of fiduciary misconduct, possibly rising to the level of criminal fraud, and that as Colleen's only child and legal heir, Iris had standing to challenge every transaction that had occurred. She also said the case would be considerably stronger with a formal establishing of paternity, which the DNA results provided once properly authenticated and filed. As Elliot's biological daughter, and with Elliot's father still living, the family lineage was documentable. We filed a formal complaint with the Ohio Bar Association against Warren Tuggle the following week. We filed a separate civil action against Douglas for breach of fiduciary duty and conversion of estate assets. Douglas, when he was served, called Iris. I was sitting right there at the kitchen table when her phone rang, and she answered it, and I watched her face go still and careful the way it did when she was angry but holding it in. He called her ungrateful. He called her naive, said she was being manipulated by lawyers who were going to take everything she had left. He told her that Colleen would be ashamed of her for tearing the family apart over money. Iris looked at me while he was talking. She held the phone a few inches from her ear so I could hear him. When he finally ran out of words, she said very quietly, "Warren Tuggle's license was suspended in 2019. I know what you did. My attorney knows what you did. Don't call me again." She hung up. Then she set the phone down on the table and looked at me, and her chin came forward. In that way it did, and she said, "Was that okay?" I said, "That was exactly right." I want to tell you about something small that happened about 6 weeks after Iris first knocked on my door. I was in the garage. I go out there sometimes on weekend mornings, not really to work on anything, just to be in a space that still smells like the projects Elliot and I used to do together. And I found a box I hadn't opened since we'd cleaned out his apartment after he died. A cardboard box with his name written on the side in my handwriting. I sat down on the concrete floor and I opened it. Inside were the usual things. A few books, some tools he'd borrowed from me, a photograph of the two of us at a Cleveland Indians game, the summer he turned 20, the year they almost made it to the series. Some papers, and at the bottom, folded once, was a printout of a MapQuest page. I hadn't seen a MapQuest printout in years, with an address in Dayton and a route from Kingsford highlighted in blue, written in pen in the margin, in Elliot's cramped handwriting, "Call first or just go." He'd been thinking about going to find her. He'd been working up to it. I sat on that garage floor for a long time. When I went back inside, Iris was at the kitchen table with her laptop. She looked up when I came in, and she could tell something had happened. She started to ask, and then she stopped, the way she does when she decides to wait. I handed her the MapQuest printout. She looked at it. She read the margin note. She looked at it for a long time. Then she folded it back along the crease and held it in her hands, and she said he was coming. I said he was coming. The civil case against Douglas is still moving through the court system as these things do. Slowly, with a great deal of paperwork and waiting, Patricia says she's optimistic. The documentation Iris assembled was thorough, and there are financial records that are difficult to explain away. In the meantime, a court order froze the remaining funds in the accounts Douglas had controlled, which means he can't move anything further. Warren Tuggle agreed to a consent agreement with the bar. His license was suspended again. Whether he'll face further consequences, we'll see. What I can tell you is that on a Tuesday afternoon in February, I drove Iris to the Social Security Administration office in Columbus, and we sat in the waiting room for 2 hours, and she filed the paperwork to be formally recognized as Elliot Raymond Klein's surviving child. There is a process for this when a parent is deceased, and it involves the DNA documentation and a signed affidavit and more waiting. But it can be done. When the clerk finished processing the initial paperwork, she looked at Iris and said, "Okay, honey, you're in the system." Iris looked at me, and she smiled. And for a second, just for a second, it was so much like Elliot's smile that I had to look at the ceiling. I am not a man who believes in signs. I've said that. I hold to that. What happened on that October night was not supernatural. It was a frightened young woman who'd driven 40 minutes in the rain to knock on a stranger's door because she had nowhere else to go. But I'll tell you this much, I don't think it's nothing that she came on that particular night, that she stood in that particular rain, that I was awake. The way I'm always awake in the dark hours because the house is too quiet. I don't think I can explain what it means. I'm a practical man and I don't have that kind of language. What I can tell you is that there is a room in my house that has a lamp on it now at night, because Iris doesn't like to wake up in a strange place in complete dark. There is a second coffee mug in the cabinet that has migrated to the front, because it's her mug. There is a drawer in the kitchen that has become, without discussion, the drawer where she puts her things. She isn't here all the time. She's young, she has her own life, her own apartment back in Dayton that she's holding on to, at least for now. But she drives up most weekends. We have an arrangement. I don't call it a schedule, because calling it a schedule would embarrass both of us. June came up from Raleigh in March to meet her. They sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours, and I mostly stayed out of the way. When June left, she hugged Iris for a long time on the porch, and she said, "You should come down to Raleigh sometime. Any time." She looked at me over Iris's shoulder when she said it, and whatever was in her face made me have to look away again. I think about that MapQuest printout. Call first, or just go. It was 26, 27, trying to figure out the right thing to do, trying to figure out how to reach across the distance without making everything worse. He was my son. Of course he was doing it that way. Careful and hesitant, working himself up to it one day at a time. He didn't make it. And I don't say that to be cruel, just to be true. He didn't make it to that drive. But she made it to me. And I've been sitting in this quiet house for 4 years not knowing what to do with all this grief that had no place to go. And now it has a place, not to put the grief. It doesn't work like that, don't let anybody tell you it does, but to put the love. That's what nobody warns you about when someone dies young. The love doesn't stop. It just has nowhere to go. It just keeps coming. Like a faucet left running in an empty room, Iris gives it somewhere to go. That's all. That's the whole story, I suppose. A girl knocked on my door at 3 in the morning, and I opened it, and my son, who was gone, had somehow still managed to reach me after all. I want to say one thing before I finish, and I want to say it plainly because I think it matters. I almost didn't open the door. I stood there in the dark for a moment before I turned the knob. I thought about the fact that I was an old man alone in a house, and it was 3 in the morning, and the rational thing was to call out through the door or look through the peephole or go back to bed and assume it was nothing. But my son's voice was on the other side of that door, or what my grief-cracked, half-asleep mind heard as his voice. And whatever the reason, whatever the explanation, I opened it. And everything that has come into my life in the months since, this girl with her chin-forward thinking face, her methodical records-keeping, her drawer in my kitchen, none of it would exist if I had chosen the rational thing. I am not saying to be reckless. I am not saying to ignore your instincts. What I am saying is this. There are moments when something knocks, and the voice on the other side of it sounds like everything you've lost, and you will be afraid, and you will be uncertain, and you should open the door anyway. That's what I know. That's what I'm still learning. The clock on the nightstand that night read 3007. I check it sometimes, in the middle of the night when I can't sleep. Most nights now it's 2 or 4 or some unremarkable time, but every now and then it reads 3007, and I lie there in the dark and I think about what was waiting on the other side of a door that I almost didn't open. And I get up, and I put the kettle on, and I wait for morning. I thought a lot about cause and effect since that October night. Not in any mystical way, I'm not built for that, but in the plainest, most practical sense. Every choice a person makes sends something forward into the world, even when they don't know it, even when they're not around to see where it lands. Elliot wrote 7 letters to a woman in Dayton. She never answered them. He kept writing anyway because that's who he was. Careful, persistent, unwilling to assume the worst about people. He never knew those letters were sitting in a box. He never knew there was a daughter. But those letters were evidence of a man who showed up with good intentions, even when the silence told him not to bother. And 26 years later, that same quality, that same willingness to knock on a door and wait, is what his daughter carried with her to my porch at 3 in the morning. She didn't get it from nowhere. You don't get that kind of quiet courage from nowhere. That's what I mean about cause and effect. Elliot's decency outlived him. It traveled forward in a person he never knew existed, and it found its way back to me. Douglas did the opposite. He saw grief and he saw an opening. He dressed it up as helpfulness and family loyalty, and underneath it was pure calculation. And I think about what that costs a person, not legally, though it cost him plenty there, but what it cost them in the actual texture of their life. To look at a grieving 25-year-old who just lost her mother and think, opportunity. I don't have a word for that beyond smallness, a smallness of character that I believe, in the end, always finds its own consequences. What Iris did took something real. She was 25 years old, alone, a few months out from burying her mother, with almost no money and a growing certainty that the one adult who'd offered to help her was stealing from her. Most people in that situation would have folded, would have told themselves it wasn't worth the fight, that they didn't have the knowledge or the resources, that they'd take whatever was left and move on. Iris didn't do that. She opened a notes app on her phone and started keeping records. She found a legal aid office. She drove 40 minutes in the rain to knock on a stranger's door at 3 in the morning because she had done the work and she knew what she needed, and she went after it. That's not luck. That's a kind of intelligence that goes beyond book learning, the intelligence of refusing to be smaller than your circumstances, and me. I think about what I almost did that night. I almost didn't open the door. I almost chose the rational thing, the safe thing, the thing a sensible 63-year-old man alone in a quiet house at 3 in the morning is supposed to do. And if I had, none of it. Iris, the kitchen drawer, the Sunday phone calls, the second mug in the cabinet, none of it would exist for me now. The door is always the question. Some version of it comes for everyone. A voice on the other side that sounds like something you've lost, or something you're afraid of, or something you can't quite explain. And you have to decide in that moment whether you're going to stand there in the dark and be sensible, or whether you're going to reach out your hand. I opened it, and I would open it again,